All right, English teacher friends. So, for this particular writing workshop, we're going to take a look at something I thought was rather interesting, Kanye West's poem Divorce. So, I'm going to throw out the caveat or make the preface of I really do not follow the comings and goings of Kanye and Kim and that whole affair. So this was deeply rooted in my students' interest. I had one particular student challenge me and say that he made the assertion that Kanye was a modern day Shakespeare and that he was a genius and brilliant and that we should spend some time analyzing his poetry. And so I said, sure, why not? We'll take a little diversion away from, contemporary or canonical text and take a look at this. And it's actually juicy enough. To dive into some deep reads. We had a very good Plato's Plato discussion, and the writing they produced was not bad. So what we'll do for this writing workshop is pretty much status quo. We'll take a look at how my templates can be used to construct the essay. And this one will have a slight deviation in the sense that we are dealing with a poem. So theoretically, you would expect us to perform literary analysis of this. But I did use this poem with my language class, my AP language class, and we dissected it for the purposes of rhetorical analysis as well. So it's pretty neat. So we're in the midst of some knee-deep test prep, so this was a nice little aside that we had to just lighten the mood a little bit, but it was still a rigorous enough academic study that we benefited from it. So I'll dive right into this and show you some tricks of the template. So one of the things I always say to teachers when I work with them is you got to Bob Ross your instruction. And here's what I mean by that. To get my students to produce the quality of writing that they do, I in a sense, embody Bob Ross. And, we'll be working on an essay. Let's say, for example, we're working on an essay where we're going to deconstruct a Sojourner Truth speech or something of that nature. I'll stand at the proverbial easel and canvas and say, all right, guys, we're performing rhetorical analysis. So we know that we're going to declare the thesis. Here's example 1, and I wrote it. Here's example 2, I wrote it. Here's example 3, I wrote it. So just like Bob Ross, get up to your easel, get up to your canvas with your paints and paint with your students. You're the expert writer in the classroom, so give them plenty of models and exemplars. Give them a template and they will thrive. So a little known secret about Bob Ross is that he only used one heuristic. We in composition often call that a template, and it was called the wet on wet technique. So literally every single time he executed a painting, it was the same template. And as far as my templates go, they're universal. You can use them for literary analysis, rhetorical analysis, which I'll show you in this writing workshop, and they're good to go for argument, persuasion, synthesis, and research. So again, remember, you're the expert writer. Write with your students. It makes a world of difference. It really demystifies the process. And then couple it with a template, and you should see some real good growth and maturation in your students. So the first question we got to ask ourselves is this: how do I write the introductory paragraph? And here's the kicker. You got two choices. You can declare or invert the thesis. And let me unpack this a little bit for you. So implicit in every prompt, and this is true for rhetorical analysis and literary analysis. All right, so for the FRQs on Lang and Lit, or if you're just doing this general ed, it's the same thing. So implicit in every prompt are two questions. What is the authorial intent? And how does the author construct meaning? So when you get into authorial intent, you're getting into like the thesis of the piece. So what is Kanye's thesis? What's his exigence? Why did he write this? Right? There's a certain motivation behind his words. What is it? So we need students to articulate that in the introduction to get anchored in a thesis. But then you also have to get into the construction of meaning. So what rhetorical or literary terms, devices were used to construct the meaning of the work as a whole. So if students answer both of those questions, they're going to come out of the gate with blazing speed. If they can manipulate the other things like voice, rhythm, flow, nuance, mechanics, they're gonna have an excellent foundation upon which to build the rest of their essay. So here's where things actually get easy for our kids with practice. So my students know that when we're performing rhetorical analysis, that we're going to declare the thesis. Always, always, always for rhetorical analysis, declare the thesis. So you're going to begin by answering the essential questions that we just looked at: authorial intent, construction of meaning. So the very first 3 sentences get at authorial intent. So you as you go from there, you want to use academic diction, of course. So I call that tier 2 level vocabulary. It's just your average run-of-the-mill SAT level word. Context background, so you got to flesh it out. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. Sentence constructs, and I talk about this in every single one of my videos, so hopefully this is not redundant or repetitive. My students are well versed in Strunk and White's theory that there's 12 different ways to construct a single sentence. It's called rule number 18, and they feature that in their book called Write It Right. So Strunk and White, Write It Right. It's a free book. You can find the PDF online. And my students practice how to manipulate their syntax for voice, rhythm, and flow. And my more adept writers are able to skillfully do that. Even my struggling and emerging students can at least attempt it. And then for my template, the introductions are always going to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less. So if you're familiar with my work and have seen my other rhetorical analysis videos, we know that I tell my students to find the most 3 salient rhetorical terms and or devices in the piece, and weave those together to articulate the thesis. And we'll explore that in a little bit. And you can backtrack and go check out those videos in my YouTube channel to get a sense. There's plenty. But since we are working with a poem, for this particular writing workshop, I'm going to focus on the inverted thesis. So I tell my students, when you're performing literary analysis, always invert the thesis. So it's just the flip of the declarative. You're going to end with the thesis. So it means you're going to begin with authorial intent, kind of a thematic focus. Sprinkle in those tier 2 so you have a good academic tone, but of course don't sound pretentious, don't sound contrived, stay in your wheelhouse. Focus on those sentence constructs for voice, rhythm, and flow, and it's always going to be 4 sentences long. So let's take a look at a few. And we'll unpack them together. So this is one that one of my students wrote, one of my better ones. So start with the authorial intent. Why did Kanye write this? It can be said that love does not know its depth and magnitude until the hour of separation. And that's kind of the whole shebang here, right? That's the impetus of his words here, the title of the poem, right? The syntactical features support this. And while in the throngs of experiencing the immediacy of this loss, everything hurts. No matter if one is just an average citizen or Hollywood's most recognizable star, the human experience of grieving wears the same face. So as we talked about earlier, in literary analysis, the first 3 sentences get at authorial intent. Look what happens in the last sentence here. The 4th sentence gets to the construction of meaning, and this is where we're going to drop the thesis. So you're going to use your terms and devices to articulate the argument. Kanye West expresses this idea in his poem through his litany of similes and frequent use of anaphora. So do you see how the terms and devices are slipped in that 4th sentence? So it's authorial intent, construction of meaning. Here's another student going to follow the exact same template. There are some things in life that are hard to reconcile, like the finality of divorce. And again, that's the thrust of the whole poem, right? Kanye is struggling to accept the fact that him and Kim are no longer a Hollywood item. But for some, acceptance can be rather elusive. In these cases, The one who's suffering and grieving can get so engrossed in their loss that they in effect spend their time beating their head against a wall, hoping to transform it into a door. All right, so we got our 3 sentences of authorial intent. Get to the construction of meaning. This idea is clearly manifest in Kanye's poem through his hyperbolic diction and grocery list of hurts. So this is really cool. Let's talk about it. So you can see here in terms of the sentence structures that nothing is like over the top fancy Nancy, but it has good rhythm, it has good flow, because typically what I see my struggling and emerging students do, and I see this all the time on College Board sample papers, is students really love to use the short simple declarative sentence. So it's short simple declarative followed by short simple declarative. So you got that chop 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 kind of flow and rhythm. And, just eyeball this real quick. You can see that, students are using different types of sentence constructs. So my guys, know about adjective clauses and parenthetical statements and infinitives and, things of that nature. So they can literally name the types of sentences that they are creating, and it helps me for grading purposes and conference purposes to be able to say things like this. Hey, Jason, do you see how these 3 sentences parallel each other? You've basically stacked 3 short, simple declarative sentences on top of each other. Why don't you take 2 and 3 and make it a parenthetical statement? And most of my students, the ones that gave me an iota of effort this year, would be able to do that. It just helps. At sentence level, to be able to talk at that level of specificity. So let's also note the tier 2 here. So this kid's got some good wheels for the vocab: reconcile, finality, elusive, engrossed, manifest, hyperbolic. And one of the things that I teach my students is voice. And a lot of teachers say, Christian, you're nuts, man. You can't teach voice. That's just kind of this innate thing. It's like trying to teach a modified basketball player, LeBron James, intangibles. And I'm like, no. I think it can be taught. So clearly this kid has the academic diction going down. And it sounds natural, right? The kid's in his wheelhouse. But I like it when my students can blend that academic with a little bit of colloquial and vernacular. So this kid weaves that in with things like beating their head against a wall, grocery list of hurts. So I tell my guys, like, write as if you're the first person who ever walked into a coffee house and said, I want a latte. Like, you are the inventor of the latte. You're the original hipster, right? So I love the voice. I love the rhythm, love the flow in this, and it's a clearly articulated thesis. There are no hiccups in here, and the template helps to yield and produce this. So here's another student, exact same template. What is the authorial intent? How does the author construct meaning? While divorce literally unbinds 2 people who vowed to stay together for life, it can shackle a person to grief and suffering. And that's the ka-ching right there. That's the whole thrust. That's the whole bingo behind why Kanye wrote this, right? It's his intent. It's his thesis. When one truly loves another person and that love comes to an end, it can be hard to accept and even harder to move on. Such losses can be so profoundly tragic that they can be difficult to give voice to. All right, so we're at the 4th sentence. How does the author construct meaning? But in Kanye's poem, he touches upon these themes through his long list of similes and simple allusions. So again, in all 3 of these, my students don't do literary terms dumping grounds in the thesis. So I tell them to focus on like the most salient, the most relevant, don't dump. And I think when I look at College Board sample papers, there's a lot of lit term dumping going on in terms of getting anchored in the thesis. And I just don't find it to be very skillful. I don't think it bodes well for the students in terms of their positioning on the rubric And coming out of the gates like this, I think College Board readers would say, "Wow, this kid's headed towards a 5 or a 6, undoubtedly. Like this is really good writing. It's got pizzazz, it's got flair, it's got skill, it's got alacrity." And then in terms of sentence constructs, look at that second sentence with the use of the hyphen. See, that's a complex sentence. And with practice, and I got some YouTube videos posted with some exercises to get students to be able to manipulate their syntax so that they can produce sentences like that. It's important to be able to wield those from time to time. So that's the introduction. So once we're done with that, the next obvious question is, how do I write the body paragraphs? And for those of you that are familiar with my work, I'm going to say nothing new, because that's the glory of these templates. They're universal. You can use them every single time you write if you're doing expository writing. So literary analysis, rhetorical analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, research, always the same approach. So we're going to tackle the body paragraphs syllogistically. Nothing changes. So I'm not going to go off onto a long explanation of the syllogistic method. I got a ton of other videos on that. You can backtrack and check those out if you're new to my work. So just a brief synopsis. The syllogism is rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn about polemics, debate, oration. And oftentimes they would just throw out like this good, juicy, girthy question. And you may have read or be familiar with Plato's Republic, where the essential question is, what is justice? And this great philosophical thinker comes to the mic and says, this is justice. And whatever definition that philosopher espouses is produced in syllogistic form. So all that means is that you're going to argue from premise to conclusion. And I think one thing that we lose sight of in all expository writing, students need to argue. And what unfortunately happens is they begin to summarize. So instead of doing literary analysis, they're doing plot analysis. Instead of doing rhetorical analysis, they're doing plot analysis. So we got to really ensure that they're arguing. So when you argue, you go premise, conclusion. So I could say something like this. Premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. So you can see there what we're going for is line of reasoning, right? So we talk about that all the time. So students need to sustain a real tight line of reasoning. I call it cogency, bulletproof logic, right? So be very mathematical in your computation. So in terms of literary analysis and rhetorical analysis, I'm going to do a little blend of both in this body paragraph. It's just an argument containing your terms and devices. So, whether they be rhetorical terms devices or literary terms devices, it doesn't matter. Rhetorical analysis and literary analysis proceed the same way in terms of the compositional execution. The second premise is going to be the textual support. I tell my students to teeter-totter balance their quoting and paraphrasing. Don't do one so much more at the expense of the other. That gets a little clumsy. And then the conclusion, and I really want to emphasize this, not the conclusion paragraph of the essay, but the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph is your textual analysis. I always tell my students that the first premise is a promise. You got to go shake hands with that guy at the end. So it's like a link, a promise, or an echo, right? You want to hear the remnant of the thesis as you conclude the body paragraph. So some students say this, Mr. Kuhn, we're using templates. We spy with our little eye that the introduction is exactly 4 sentences long, no more, no less. You must have a magic number of sentences for the syllogistic body paragraph. And I do. I find that those short little itty bitty 4, 5, 6 sentence body paragraphs just are not sufficient enough in terms of offering enough support and analysis to substantiate the argument fully. So I tell my students to shoot for 10 sentences, hard cap at 12. I find if they go above and beyond 12 sentences, they're going to blow V8, get wayward, get into summary, and most likely break the line of reasoning. So it's just too much extraneous stuff that need not be there. So let's break this down. And again, for those of you that are familiar with my work, nothing changes here. The first 3 sentences comprise the first premise. And what I have my students do is this. I tell them, establish your chronology, establish your sequence. Give the reader a clear understanding that you're going to establish a line of reasoning. So my students often look at their screens and blank papers and they say, where do I begin? And the most logical thing to do is to begin where Kanye begins. So you'll see my students transition with phrases like this right from the onset, right? Cue your reader that you are not a sloppy writer, that you are organized, right? That you have a very methodic approach that you're going to take in terms of making a logical, cogent argument. So begin where Kanye begins. In these first 3 sentences, you want to multitask your terms and devices, because oftentimes students have incomplete reads because they single task. And when you do that, you literally would have to construct the essay this way: 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph syntax. But what I want my students to do is to begin to see how pieces hold hands with each other, how they interlock, how they interconnect. So how does the syntax yield the tone? Or like, how does a syntactical maneuver create a tone shift? Like, link the two together and proceed that way. So you got to make sure you're arguing. Got to make sure you're linking terms in these first 3 sentences, which comprise the first premise. So let's see what happens here. Right from the onset, Kanye anchors his sorrow in simple and relatable comparisons. So you got the juxtaposition or the similes, whatever you want to call it. Using the blunt force of short, simple, declarative sentences, he offers an exhaustive litany of similes to express what his divorce from Kim Kardashian feels like. As if to convey that words are inadequate, his seemingly endless enumeration of grief goes on at great lengths. So when I workshop with students, I often pause right there at the end of the 3rd sentence and say, all right, if we are going to articulate your first premise as a promise, what are you guaranteeing your reader a discussion of? And if we break this down, I am expecting in the rest of the syllogistic body paragraph to take a look at comparisons. There's mention of syntax, and then the litany, the enumeration. So if we're going to sustain a line of reasoning, nothing else extraneous should come in here. We have to promise a discussion of those 3 things. So all the quotes and paraphrases must be germane to those 3 traits that we talked about up in the first premise. So in the 4th sentence, we transition to the second premise, which is our support. So I tell my guys, get right into it, right? Start quoting, start paraphrasing. So it's a 1, 2, 3 punch: quote, paraphrase, analysis, just all the way through. So you got to make sure you have enough support and enough analysis to keep the promise of the first premise and sustain the line of reasoning. So let's see where we go here. Immediately, so that his audience can relate at the gut level, he suggests that divorce feels like full-blown COVID. So what happens is sometimes students quote and then they run away. They just quote drop it, quote dump, and boom, they're out of here. We quoted, we got to analyze that. We got to unpack that and keep it all beneath the umbrella concept of the first premise. Writing this poem and experiencing this divorce in the midst of a global pandemic, West correlates his feelings to perhaps the biggest shared fear: catching COVID. So do you see how that's connected? You got to analyze. As is clear, COVID can stop an entire world dead in its tracks. It is ruthless and shows no mercy. This opening line is at the crux of establishing his ethos and pathos in terms of the universality of experiencing and processing loss. But as to come off, but as to come off as not being a sad, hyperbolic emo sap, he backs off so as not to come off as being overly dramatic by informing us that divorce feels like your doctor don't know shit. So let's talk about this here. So, um, one thing that you'll see my students do is have pretty good, smooth, silky quote transitions. I tell my guys I want it to sound conversational. Quote as if you're talking, right? So, walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. There's a simple way to get them to do that. It's called the 5-word rule. If you place a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keep the quote small, it should sound conversational. You'll have to teach your students how to bracket because sometimes that needs to be done to keep the conversational flow going. But yeah, that's an easy way. 5-word rule. So we quoted, we got to analyze. There is a helplessness and certain degree of frustration when that happens. Doctors quite clearly serve a purpose, but very often they prove their fallibility and limitations as well, which leaves the patient in a lurch. So again, we're going to move on here. We talked about syntax up top in the first premise. Get at it. Syntactically, it is important to notice that Kanye does not conclude his statements properly with a period. In doing this, it is clear that his suffering is likewise without end. The first word of every line places emphasis on the subject of his anguish, divorce. Bold and capitalized, we are repeatedly reminded that his separation from Kim is the cause of his spiritual beating every evening. All right, so we drew from the text a few times here. We're doing all right. We're sustaining our line of reasoning. We have not broken that. We've not deviated, but we're not done yet. Rhetorically, the litany. There we go. Now we got all three. We got all three of our promises kept. The litany makes sure to not trespass into pathetic terrain, so Kanye drops something heavy and then backtracks and lightens the mood. For example, perhaps alluding to Jesus, we are told that divorce feels like nails in your hand. On one hand, he juxtaposes his divorce to crucifixion, but in the next breath, he suggests that divorce feels like Michael Myers. This illusion pumps the brakes on his not overdoing the emotional vomiting. Right. So let's talk about a couple of things here. So you can see here this kid, right, is continuing that blend of the academic with the colloquial and vernacular. Let me go back for a second here. I love this right here. Not being a sad, hyperbolic, emo sap. So I tell my guys, go for pizzazz. You're 16, 17, man. Show your spark, right? Show that you got a good noodle up in that head and that you got personality. That's how you get the voice point, right? And saying things like the emotional vomiting. So kids can do that in their writing. I think it adds nice flair, especially if they can couple it and balance it and not overdo it with the academic. So we're at the end of the second premise, and we got to wrap it up here. So just in a couple of sentences, echo that thesis and tie it all back to the first premise. It is important to keep in mind that although Kanye is going very public with his grief, he has a reputation and image to uphold. In keeping up the facade and manipulation of Kim, he treads a very deliberate line so as not to diminish himself while playing his sympathy card. Right? So you tie it back to his ethos. That's kind of the whole gist. He's got a little smoke and mirrors thing going on. And I think one of the important things that we talked about in our analysis of this, because kids know so much, most of our kids know so much about the comings and goings of the Kardashians and Kanye and all the other characters involved in the play, that it's a really good discussion about don't bring extraneous things into your reads. So oftentimes, especially when we're reading historical texts, if a student knows a little bit of the history, they want to give like a historical summation of whatever it is, the topic at hand. And all you can go on are the words, right? The diction of Kanye with regards to this particular poem. and students wanted to bring in other text, other characters, other incidents, the whole byline and by story. And I'm like, nope, 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 nope. You can only go based on the poem. Nothing else matters. So that was a good learning lesson for them. So all right, that takes me to the end. So hopefully, if you haven't already, you subscribe to this channel. I'm going to be loading it in the coming weeks and months. I got a number of irons in the fire, so I'm doing some work with Perfection Learning. It looks like once a month I'll be doing a free webinar with them. And I can talk about all things templates. I have my alternative grading methods, my Play-Doh discussions. So it's kind of up to them, and we'll announce everything in the Facebook groups as those dates and topics near. Also got an iron in the fire with the National Writing Project. We have some projects on doc, and again, we'll let you know about those things. And then I'm assuming most of you know that great feller by the name of Tim Freitas, the Garden of English guy. We are co-authoring a textbook together where we're going to basically highlight the differences and similarities of our templates and the idea that there's many ways to skin the compositional fish. So we're in the midst of writing that. I am in the research gathering phase. So I created something called the Teach It Right 5-week mastermind. So I'm currently working with just a small group of teachers, and I'm going to run this a few times up through the fall, most likely. So the current iteration, I'm working with just 3 teachers. I keep the groups very small, and we are equipping the teachers with my templates, all my Nuance Academy things with regards to like how do I equip my students with the voice, the rhythm, the flow, the mechanics, the basics, the foundational things that you see them doing well. And then the teachers go into the classroom and try their hand at it. We collaborate together a lot. There's a lot of content being produced during these 5 weeks. And at present, we're meeting Thursday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time over a 5-week period. And ultimately, we just kind of work together, looking to revamp, retool, become better composition teachers. So if you like what you're seeing here with my work and want to learn more, then drop me an email, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. And we can discuss that 5-week mastermind a little more or anything. Also, if you want the PowerPoint that is featured here in this presentation, I can fire that off to you. Just email me, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. And I do have a website. There's a bunch of free content on there, and there's information about that mastermind as well, teachinghowtowrite.com. So hopefully you found this to be useful, and your students love analyzing Kanye as much as my students did. So for now, be well, happy teaching, happy writing.